The New York Times reported the following on the 19th of March, 1897. Quote, Monday found the old iron vessel buffeted about at the mercy of a full gale and turbulent seas. That night, the elements broke out in a wild frenzy. The combers made a breach over the decks. They ripped off the hatches, and under their terrific bombardment, the doors of the cabin were battered in. Water flooded the saloon, filled the hold, and rushed into the engine room.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Suffering of the Ville de St Nazaire?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Ville de St Nazaire was built in Bordeaux in 1870, and for most of the time, the 2,640-ton single-screw steamship was occupied with the Marseille to Cologne route. Eventually, her owners, Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, better known as the French Line, would change her to carrying freight between New York and various West Indian and South American ports as the company needed. It was a new route just established by the French Line. The Ville de St Nazaire had already completed one voyage in this capacity, and on March 6, 1897, she departed from New York on a voyage that was supposed to take her to ports in Haiti, Dominica, Jamaica, Venezuela, and Barbados, with her first stop expected to be Puerto Rico on March 11th. Though the main role of the Ville de St Nazaire was to carry freight, the newspapers would later announce that she had $25,000 worth of gold on board as she departed from New York. She did still have passenger accommodations as well. She could carry up to 30 passengers on her voyages, though on this voyage she would only have 11, one of them being an employee of the French Line, who was traveling as an inspector for the line. In addition to the passengers, there were 71 members of the crew under the command of Captain Jaguenot. They met with bad weather from the start of their voyage. The Atlantic had been experiencing a series of storms, which the New York Times described as having strewn the Atlantic with wreckage. As the Ville de St Nazaire began her voyage, she was immediately met with heavy mist that covered the ocean and strong winds. On the very first day, they also realized that the ship had a leak, but since it was able to be managed with the ship's pumps, it was decided not to turn around. Unlike many ships by the late 1890s, the aging Ville de St Nazaire only had one transverse bulkhead, which meant that maybe the crew should have shown more worry about a leak right after leaving port. Still, in spite of her age, the Ville de St Nazaire was considered a well-maintained ship that was perfectly seaworthy, and her crew seems to have had confidence in her ability to weather the storm. The next day brought even stronger wind, and by Monday, the third day of the voyage, they were in the grips of a powerful gale. Captain Jaguenot, as a precaution, ordered that provisions be loaded into the ship's boats in case they needed to evacuate the ship. But as water had surged through the ship, it had already destroyed most of the ship's stores before he ever gave the order. As night fell, the waves began to sweep the deck of the ship and rip off the ship's hatches. The doors of the cabin were smashed in, and the water rushed through the ship's saloon and went down into the hold of the ship. Soon, the engine room was flooded, and the fires were extinguished. Caught in the water, the engines no longer usable, and the engine room full of thick and dangerous steam. The engine crew fled to the deck of the Ville de St Nazaire. Once they had lost their engines, the Ville de St Nazaire was entirely at the mercy of the waves. It would not be long before she fell into a trough in the waves, and by the next morning, the morning of the 8th, she had settled so only her deck was above the water. The passengers and crew had been entirely driven to the deck at this point, with the passengers being placed on top of the cabin for their safety, while the crew began the battle to prepare and launch the boats. The voyage of the Ville de St Nazaire had ended with the ship only reaching the seas off of Cape Hatteras. The desperate struggle to get the boats launched while the storm was still at its height was a matter of life and death, and repeatedly the crew was beaten back by the waves, with some of them being washed overboard with every attempt. The Ville de St Nazaire had 8 boats in total, and the first 4 boats they launched were smashed as they were lowered, and sailors were lost in this way as well. The final 4 boats were successfully launched, but there was no time to hunt for provisions in this rapidly sinking ship. The boats were launched with a little bit of biscuit, but no water on board. One boat was under the command of Captain Jaguenot and contained 8 people. Another was under the command of Second Captain Nueoli with 29 people on board. A third was under the command of Captain Betty, who had been traveling as an inspector for the French line, with 38 people. And the last one, it was estimated, had only 6 or 7 on board at most. The escape from the ship was a chaotic one. It was hard for anyone to tell what happened to the other boats, and how many people were on them for how long. There would be a report of 2 of the boats being seen soon after the departure from the ship tied together, but empty. But later events would suggest that this had not been the case. It was also said that the boat under the command of Captain Jaguenot had capsized soon after leaving the ship, but others would say that they had it in sight for a short time. Though it was clear things were indeed going badly on the captain's boat, it was still upright. A part of this confusion would be that as the boats departed from the ship, it was almost midnight, and the darkness added to the chaos. In less than a day after the departure from the sinking Ville de St Nazaire, the boats were out of sight of one another, and each boat had no way of knowing on the stormy seas if they would ever see anyone again, or if they were now the only survivors. On the 14th of March, Captain Rhines of the schooner the Hilda spotted a boat when the Hilda was about 80 miles from the coast of Virginia, and since the boat was only about 2 miles distant, he ordered that his ship change directions to investigate it. As it got closer, they could see men in it. But even though they shouted at the men, they showed no recognition in their actions, and did not respond. Even after they threw a rope down into the boat, no one moved, and Captain Rhines was forced to send one of his men down into the boat to tie the rope, so the boat would not drift away, and then more sailors followed to carry the 4 men in the boat up to safety. There were the remains of 4 other men in the boat, and Captain Hilda ordered that the boat be released from the ship once the 4 men who were living were up on deck. The survivors were Captain Betty, 4th Engineer Pierre Sauts, passenger Juan de Dios Tejada, and the ship's doctor Alphonse Mer. They had been in the boat for 6 days, with no water, and only a little salt water-soaked ship's biscuit to eat. It would take some time for the 4 survivors to be able to speak. They were given fluids and a little food, but they were unable to eat. Their clothing was soaking wet. There had been another storm the day before, and all of their limbs were so swollen that they could not stand on their own. Captain Betty, the inspector who had been traveling with the Ville de St Nazaire, as part of his duties, had been the first to be able to say much, though even this took effort. He told Captain Rhines that, rather than the 8 people that they had seen at first, their boat had 38 people in it initially, though half of that number had not survived the first night in the boat. When they had left the Ville de St Nazaire, Captain Betty had brought with him a lantern which he tried to use to help the boats keep together in the darkness, but the waves had been so violent that the lantern had been smashed. The waves that pounded the boat washed people overboard, and half filled the boat with water, which the people who held on were forced to endure. There had been 2 women on board the ship, one a stewardess and one a passenger named Mrs. Tejada, who was traveling with her husband and 4 children. The Tejada family was, however, on the boat under the command of Captain Betty. The Tejada children were some of the first to pass away from starvation, the lack of water on the boat, and the elements. Mrs. Tejada was supported through this by her husband, who did his best to care for her even in such a situation, but crazed by thirst she finally went behind his back and drank some of the seawater. A few hours later, in a state of delirium, she passed away. Mr. Tejada, it was reported, went insane afterward, having lost his entire family, and the rest of the men on the boat were barely able to restrain him from throwing himself in the water. At least one man on the boat did make the decision to do so. Others were drowned when they passed out from exhaustion and fell into the water that was at the bottom of the boat. Eventually, the survivors were too weak to give them a burial at sea, and the dead remained. Rescue did not restore Tejada to his senses. Captain Rhines did his best to nurse the men back to health, but as they approached New York, he acknowledged that they needed much more care than he was able to offer on board his ship. When a tug came out to bring him into the port, he had the 4 survivors transferred to the tug to be brought straight to shore for medical attention. The 3 employees of the French line were very weak and needed to be carried or helped along. But Mr. Tejada was anything but calm and showed clear signs of shock. Captain Betty was weak enough that he was immediately put under a doctor's care, who told the papers that he was too weak to speak with anyone. Dr. Mer and Engineer Sauts were both brought to the company steamship La Bourgogne, where they were cared for by the ship's doctor. Mr. Tejada was confined to bed where he slowly returned to his senses, only to be forced to come to terms with what had happened to him and his family. Considering the condition of the 4 men, the papers could be excused for publishing the story that only 4 had survived the terrible shipwreck of the Ville de St Nazaire. But there would soon be better news. Two days before the Hilda had picked up the 4 men and brought them to New York, the British tramp steamer Yanariva had spotted a small boat floating on the ocean while flying distress signals. Under the orders of Captain Weston, they went toward the boat to investigate and threw ropes down, but none of the men in the boat were able to help themselves. They had to be carried up to the deck of the Yanariva. 2 of the men on the boat had reportedly become delirious and were raving at the bottom of the boat. The boat had in it Second Captain Noeoli, a passenger named Nicolas Sauvenel, 2nd Engineer Germain Giraud, 3rd Engineer Larenzetti, and 12 survivors, all of whom were from Martinique. The rescue was successful, though it was a tense time for Captain Weston and his men, since they knew that if they got too close to the little boat, they might swamp her, or she might smash on the side of their ship, since the seas were still rough. 2nd Captain Noeoli reported that they had no oars on their boat, and only a very small tin of biscuit with no water provisions at all. They had managed to rig a sail, and 2nd Captain Noeoli had managed the almost impossible task in the conditions they were in of keeping the boat sailing dead before the wind, thus preventing the boat from being swamped. The water was constantly breaking over the boat, and the people on board were forced to bail with their caps, lest the boat be entirely swamped. It was an exercise that was credited with having saved their lives since it kept them moving. 29 people had left the Ville de St Nazaire on board the boat, but slowly they succumbed to the cold, thirst, and hunger. The thirst proved to be the greatest danger, with men choosing to drink seawater to escape its torment, only to then suffer even more. Though the rest of the people in the boat would try to prevent it, the people who drank the seawater would eventually throw themselves into the sea to escape from the torture they were experiencing. By the time that the Yanariva found them, there were only 16 people left, and it was calculated that if it had been a few hours later, there would have been no trace of them at all. The boat was slowly filling with water faster than they could bail, especially in their weakened states, and they calculated that the boat would have sunk within 5 hours of the time they were rescued. On hearing that there had been other boats that had escaped from the sinking Ville de St Nazaire, Captain Weston ordered lookouts to be placed to keep an eye out for any signs of other survivors, but they did not find any. It would be 3 days before the people who had been rescued by the Yanariva would be able to eat food. As they crossed the Atlantic, the survivors gained strength, and on their arrival in Glasgow on the 28th of March, Captain Weston expressed great pride in the fact that they had managed to nurse all of the weakened men back to health during the voyage. News quickly spread that the Yanariva had found more people from the Ville de St Nazaire, and that rather than 4 survivors, it turned out it was 20. The French consul rushed to meet with the Yanariva and her crew and express his thanks. It would be reported that the steamer Maura had passed the Lizard Light and signaled that she had the captain and an engineer of the Ville de St Nazaire on board. She would arrive in Hamburg with Captain Jaguanu, Chief Engineer Philip Mariani, and 2 sailors. There had originally been 9 people on their boat, they said, but 5, including the stewardess, had died from drinking seawater, since their boat was also without provisions. They had been picked up by the Maura on March 13th, in a poorer condition as the people on the other boats. But they were also met with kindness, and by the time they reached Germany, they were able to walk onto the shore. This brought the total of survivors from the 4 that were first believed to be left to 24. A staggering leap when everyone had given up hope. There was a report of one last boat from the Ville de St Nazaire, however. On the 22nd of March, before anyone knew that 16 more survivors were on board the Yanariva, Captain Gagger of the steamship the Creole arrived in New York. He reported that he had found a boat from the Ville de St Nazaire on the 21st of March. At first, he had passed by the boat without thinking much of it, since it was filled with water. The news of the 4 men being rescued by the Hilda was already well known, though, so after thinking about it for a moment, he had turned his ship around to investigate. Once he got closer, he was met with the ghastly sight of the remains of 6 people, all resting at the bottom of the water-filled boat. As they tried to lift the boat, it tipped, and with the water leaving the boat, the remains also were washed into the sea where they sank. The boat was brought back to New York for inspection, but there was little that could be found in it other than some clothing items. It only served as a stark reminder that 62 people had been lost with the Ville de St Nazaire, with most of them having drifted lost at sea, with no help in sight.
For more information, please see the Western Argus from May 13th, 1897, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.